start reading about haiku, you quickly run into a lot of words that sound like haiku but aren't haiku. For instance, haiku is different than hokku, which is different than haikai, which is different than haibun, all of which are related to something called renga. How do we delineate all these terms from each other? Well, haiku, as we talked about in our last video, is what we now call this 575 form. Now, the 575 form, as we talked about last time, has some subtleties to it. It's interested primarily in description of physical sensory things, not just things you can see, but things we can hear, sometimes things we can smell, duration of time, the experience of nature. It even has some connections to Zen Buddhism, and maybe we'll get into some of that in a future video. But haiku is actually not the word that the original writers of haiku, say in the 1600s, would have used for this 575 form. They would have called it a hokku. Now, why the difference? Well, we have to actually talk about a previous form in order to understand hokku and how it became haiku. Now, from the Heian period to what we call the Edo period, or the Tokugawa shogunate during the 1600s, there's about 600 years. The Tonka tradition, where you have the 57577 form, that developed over hundreds of years into many different ways of playing with that line of 5 syllables and that line of 7 syllables. And one of the main ways it developed was into this tradition called renga, where a group of poets, sometimes this happened at parties, sometimes this happened at literary gatherings, a group of poets would get together and compose a long poem together. The first poet would write a stanza of 575, the next poet would write a stanza of 77, and then back to 575, and then to 77, and you'd write this long linked verse. And you'd riff on and develop the ideas in the previous stanza, or maybe you'd add to images. Maybe there'd be some ironic inversion of what's claimed before. It was a fun party game, and it led to lots of really interesting poetry being written. Well, this first stanza, the 575, came to be called the Hokku. It wasn't a standalone form. It was kind of what gets everyone started. And usually, if you were at a literary gathering, the senior-most poet, sort of the most respected, often the elder-most poet, would write the haiku to get the renga going. And so what you end up having is you have these poets, by the time of Basho in the 1600s, you have these poets who become famous for their haiku. Now, their haiku, like I just said, wasn't its own poem. It was sort of the poem that could get you started. And so you could write a haiku, as you're traveling around Japan, say, and then when you show up to a party, you could say, I have these several haiku I've written. Which would you like to pick to start a renga chain with? These haiku ended up being written also within another form called Haibun. Now, Haibun, which Basho, once again, was a master of it. We're going to keep coming back to this Basho being a master of many forms. A Haibun was a prose narrative, usually about travel, that had haiku embedded within it. Basically, I was walking to this famous temple, I walked up this hill, I, saw the wind through the trees at this famous temple, and I wrote this haiku to describe the beauty of the scene, or the loneliness of the scene. And so Haibun, prose with embedded haiku, becomes its own tradition. Now, these haiku would have been thought of in the 16 and 1700s as, once again, the beginning stanza of a renga. But as Haibun and haiku were written more and more and became more masterfully composed, that's when poets like Basho and poets after him begin to think of haiku as their own form. It wasn't until the 19th century that poets started calling those haiku to distinguish them as forms on their own, not to be considered as the beginning of a renga, but as their own form. So when we say haiku, we really mean a standalone haiku, which originally would have been written at the beginning of a renga or as part of Haibun. Now we have this other word, haikai, which was a word that was used for renga, which were written in a very casual demotic language, not a high aristocratic language. So renga, haikai, haibun, hokku, and finally haiku. Do you have it all straight in your head?